This is The Real Story from the BBC. I'm Chris Morris with your weekly deep dive into a story that's making news and changing lives. And this week, following several days of peace talks in South Africa, the government of Ethiopia and officials from the Tigray region signed an agreement earlier this month to end fighting after almost 2 years of renewed civil war.
Two parties in the Ethiopian conflict have formally agreed to the cessation of hostilities, as well as to systematic, orderly, smooth and coordinated disarmament.
The conflict between the Ethiopian government and forces in its northern Tigray region has thrown the country into turmoil. It's destabilised Africa's second most populous nation and created what may be the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Reliable estimates say hundreds of thousands of people have been killed and millions are in need of urgent food and medical aid.
I used to feed my son rice, macaroni, pasta, and he was growing up well. But now there is nothing. My breasts even dried up. I eat once a day if it's available.
The Tigrayans say the war has to end.
The war was imposed on the people of Tigray, and we've been defending our interests. But we have reached a point where the number of civilian casualties and humanitarian catastrophe has reached a level where sustaining yet another round of conflict can only be exceptionally disastrous.
Aid agencies also say the conflict has led to a catastrophic humanitarian situation. And the UN says the impact of the fighting has been devastating for people in the region.
Civilians are paying a horrific price. Indiscriminate attacks, including in residential areas, are killing more innocent people every day, damaging critical infrastructure and limiting access to vital services. Hundreds of thousands of people have been forced to flee their homes, and we are also hearing disturbing accounts of sexual violence and other acts of brutality against women, children and men.
The Ethiopian Prime Minister has promised to implement the deal agreed with the Tigrayans.
What we saw in Tigray is that the people want peace. If we can continue like this, I think it will be good. For my part, I want to see peace. I'm happy that peace is coming. I want to do all I can to make sure that this peace remains intact.
But will this recently signed agreement lead to a lasting peace? Well, last weekend, a follow-up deal on how to implement the peace agreement was signed, and it includes an explicit provision that disarmament of Tigrayan forces has to happen alongside the withdrawal of foreign military forces and other fighters from Tigray, all except the Ethiopian army. That's significant. Secondly, humanitarian aid is also finally beginning to trickle in. But the really hard work of implementing the deal and helping millions of people survive is still ahead of us. I have a panel of experts with me to explain and dissect what all this means. And I'm going to begin by asking each of them to answer one broad question about how we got to this perilous point. Alex Duval is the Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He's the author of a number of books on Africa, including The Real Politics of the Horn of Africa, Money, War and the Business of Power. He joins us from Boston. Alex, let's start with a brief definition. What exactly is Tigray?
Tigray is the northernmost region of Ethiopia. It had a pre-war population of about 6.5 million, though that number is now much reduced by starvation, disease and war. It's the historic center of Ethiopian highland civilization. It's the location of the classical era Aksumite civilization. And it is the birthplace of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, the movement that led the armed struggle that overthrew the military regime in 1991 and put in place the current federal constitution of Ethiopia, which, among other things, vests sovereignty in the nations and peoples of Ethiopia, of which the Tigrayans are one.
Alex, thanks very much. Also with us, Sizale Lema is an Ethiopian journalist and a leading advocate of media and press freedom. She's the founder of Addis Standard Publications, and she joined us from Germany. Sizale, how does Tigray fit into the rest of Ethiopia?
Well, that's a very critical question, particularly at this point in time, because we are coming out, hopefully, of a war that has literally ripped off Tigray out of the Ethiopian body politic. whether politically, economically, socially, religiously, culturally, in whichever way you look at it, Tigray has been violently disconnected from the Ethiopian body politic and the society. And so how does Tigray fit back into the federation is the question that nobody is right now reckoning with. It will be a process of years and years to come.
Part of that process, obviously, is will this peace hold? And also with us is Alex Rondos. He was the EU Special Representative to the Horn of Africa from 2012 until 2021. He now works for the Finland-based Crisis Management Initiative, Marty Ahtisaari's Peace Foundation, and he joins us from Nairobi. Alex Rondos, ceasefires seem to come and go in Tigray. Is this one more significant than what we've seen before?
Yes, I think it is. For the first time, the parties have committed themselves on paper and publicly, meaning that both have decided to make a very public choice about who they intend to live with and work with, if this will hold, as you say. But it is the first time they've done that. And I think that then holds them to a set of political commitments, which they will have to handle with their own domestic constituencies, and we shouldn't underestimate that. If you step back a bit, I think what really drives them now, and we must all see if we can support, is the fact that Tigray was confronted by famine and the government in Ethiopia was confronted by financial collapse. The economy is hemorrhaged to such an extent in order to fight this war, while there are a whole set of other vital issues and violence occurring elsewhere in the country. So they have every reason to try to make this work.
Right, thanks to all of you for those initial remarks. Let's try and get a little deeper into how we got here. The Ethiopian government's war against the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which dominates that region, is rooted in old grievances between the political elites of ethnically based regions. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's ascent to power in 2018 ended nearly 3 decades of dominance by the TPLF over Ethiopia's central government. Now, soldiers from neighbouring Eritrea are also fighting in Tigray alongside the Ethiopian government forces, and all sides have been accused of atrocities. A power struggle, an election and a push for political reform are among many factors that led to this crisis. So I suppose the first question out of all of this, Sedale, was this an avoidable conflict, or were the disposition of forces and the bitter rivalries surrounding them making this almost inevitable?
It was an avoidable war. There were so many warning signs, not only in the run-up to the war, but even before, when the prime minister was taking a radical shift of dismantling the former ruling party that was dominated by the TPLF, which is called the EPRDF government. As soon as he took over the Ethiopian state, the way in which he dismantled the EPRDF was obvious that it was going to invite an intra-party violent confrontation. The prime minister went and literally banged it.
Alex Zavala, it is quite extraordinary, isn't it, that Abiy Ahmed won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019, and yet a year later he was at war inside his own country. Is he a damaged figure internationally?
I think he is certainly damaged internationally, and that Nobel Peace Prize is actually part of the core of the problem, because that Peace Prize was awarded primarily for a peace agreement that he made with President Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea. There'd been a serious war some 20 years ago between the two countries, and then a cold peace. And Abiy flew to the Eritrean capital, Asmara, and embraced Isaias and made peace and ended that conflict, for which he won the Nobel Prize. But the agreement was never made public, and it wasn't subject to the normal sorts of scrutiny and provisions for openness and democratization that one might have expected. And clearly underpinning it was actually a security pact. And the political dispute that existed and was intensifying, as Sedale has just said, between Abiy and the Tigrayans, was then intermixed with a long-standing grudge between President Isaias and the TPLF. And that was actually a much higher stakes game. That was a game in which Isaias had clearly expressed the intention not just to dismantle the TPLF as a major political power, but actually to crush Tigray as a region and drive it back generations in terms of its economic development and capacity.
And while we talk about some of the long-term causes of the conflict, we should also obviously look at some of the really disastrous consequences, war crimes and a massive humanitarian crisis. An important part of the peace plan is a promise of unhindered access for aid to reach a population now facing disease and famine. And to give you a sense of scale, the World Health Organization says almost 90% of people in Tigray need food aid. Now, this week there have been glimmers of good news. 2 truckloads of medical aid and a food convoy have reached the Tigrayan capital, Mekelle, the first to do so since the ceasefire was signed 2 weeks ago. In fact, it's the first delivery of international aid into Tigray since a previous ceasefire broke down in August. Ethiopia's government says it's also begun supplying some aid. Dr. Fasiga Amdeslassi is a surgeon at Mekelle's Ida Referral Hospital, the largest hospital in Tigray.
The last couple of years were very terrible for us, for healthcare workers in Tigray. We have seen patients. We know the disease, we know the diagnosis of the illness, but we can't do nothing to them. We can't operate. Multiple times we send them back to home. And then there was this hunger, our staffs getting hungry, nurses, porters who collapsed on the floors. We ourselves were not sure whether we will continue to feed ourselves. Our children are locked in our homes, not be able to go to school.
Well, the need is clearly acute. The BBC has found that nearly 2,500 children died of malnutrition in Tigray last year alone, and the number of people displaced and at risk is staggering. It's hard to be more precise because communications are difficult and journalists are simply not being given access to Tigray. But last month, our Africa correspondent, Catherine Biaruhanga in Nairobi, managed to gather some testimonies of what's happening and sent this report.
The faint cries of children stuck in the middle of one of the world's deadliest but most hidden wars. It's almost impossible to know what's happening there. Phone and internet lines have mostly been cut, while access by road and air is tightly controlled by the central government. The biggest concern is for children. A video from the far north district of Aferom shows starving mothers trying to take care of their malnourished children.
I used to feed my son rice, macaroni, pasta, and he was growing up well. But now there is nothing. My breasts even dried up. I eat once a day if it's available.
For many weeks, my team and I have reached out to contacts in Tigray over patchy networks to try to uncover what's going on.
The mobile subscriber cannot be reached.
Data gathered by regional health workers shows that thousands of children who became severely malnourished have died since the war began. We asked the Ethiopian government for an interview about children's health in Tigray, but it did not respond. In the past, officials have said there is no deliberate blockade of Tigray.
That was Catherine Biaruhanga reporting. Well, as you'd expect, we also asked the Ethiopian government for an interview, but it never happened. The Ethiopian ambassador in London said yes, but then pulled out. So later in the programme, you'll hear an extract from a recent interview a government representative gave to the BBC. But for now, I'm going to go back to a discussion with our panel. Alex Duval, to what extent do you think the humanitarian crisis forced the two sides back to the negotiating table, especially, I presume, on the Tigrayan side?
I think it definitely did. I think the sad, somber, terrifying lesson of what has happened is that it shows that starvation works. The government of Ethiopia and the state of Eritrea used starvation relentlessly as their principal weapon of war. They destroyed everything that was indispensable for the survival of the civilian population when they were in occupation of Tigray: foodstuffs, water supplies, medical facilities, etc. And then they subjected Tigray to a starvation siege in which, during the course of nearly a year, perhaps 15% of the minimum required ration was actually permitted to go in. And there's a team of Belgian academics who have studied what data can be obtained, and they estimate that between 383,000 and 800,000 Tigrayans perished from starvation and disease over the last 2 years. So that really brought Tigray to the point of utter collapse. And if any doubt lingered in anyone's mind that the government was not deliberately using starvation as a tactic. And that doubt would have been put to rest immediately after the ceasefire was signed in South Africa, when the government said, we will be allowing aid back in, but only when federal authority is restored. So they were conditioning the essential right of life-saving assistance on their own political agenda.
Alex Rondos, we've said that communication with the region is so very difficult, but we talk about the population in Tigray facing famine. In your analysis, can it be avoided?
Well, it can now if the government intends to lift all its blockade. It's quite simple. This is a country that's a region of a country that's been deliberately besieged. It's one of the hidden horrors of the current international scene, and it's a blot on the moral landscape of the international community that nothing really has been done. So if the risk of starvation is to be, further starvation is to be eliminated, the first thing that has to happen is the international community has to say, the first dividend of peace is those who are hungry get food. And then the governments who are blocking this so far, if they show they're going to continue to allow the future supply of food, might then get a more positive and favorable response to their request. But let's be clear in the order of priorities here. That's what's going to do it. Otherwise, this is going to be a hidden famine that will go on, not for the first time in the last 100 years that we have witnessed. And it's just tragic that 2 years on, people are not willing to stand up and admit to it and just simply, end up with some pusillanimous arguments that they should be embarrassed by.
OK, let's have a listen to what the Tigrayans themselves are saying about the peace deal and about the role of the ENDF, the Ethiopian National Defence Force, and other combatants. Communications with Mekelle, the capital, as we've said, are patchy at best. Internet access is often cut off. But we got through to the spokesman for the TPLF, Getachew Reda, in Mekelle, and I asked him first if the centrepiece of this agreement, the actual cessation of hostilities, was holding.
There is widespread atrocities being conducted by the Eritrean forces. Otherwise, as far as military engagement goes, there has been a marked decline in incidents.
Are you alleging that Eritrean forces are still committing atrocities as we speak?
Yes, as we speak. Widespread looting, destruction of property, and killing of civilians.
Did you sign the peace deal because you were losing?
We signed the peace deal because it has always been our agenda, and we can see that the fighting has been increasing the number of IDPs, creating more and more humanitarian catastrophe. And we knew that as long as political problems can be resolved through political dialogue, there is no reason for us to continue fighting till hell freezes over. That's pretty much why we signed the deal, because it has always been our strategic choice, and it's better late than never.
But you've agreed to the disarmament of TPLF fighters. You've agreed to the re-establishment of federal authority over Tigray. There's no reference, as you wanted, to the government of Tigray in the agreement. These are big concessions. It doesn't sound like you've made them from a winning position.
Look, we went to Pretoria to sign a cessation of hostilities agreement. What the government side came up with what they call permanent cessation of hostilities. There is no such thing as permanent cessation of hostilities as far as we're concerned, but they also introduced some political elements which, under the circumstances, could only be resolved through political dialogue. So the main focus of our negotiations was ensuring cessation of hostilities. Yes, they have all kinds of legal, quote-unquote, reasons why they shouldn't refer to Tigray Authority as the Tigray government for obvious reasons. So what we did see throughout the discussions was that they would have to deal with facts as they exist. And of course, they would have to deal with Tigray authorities, whether they call it Tigray government or anything is of secondary importance, because what matters right now is making sure that the suffering and the humanitarian catastrophe comes to an end, and we somehow silence the guns. The agreement calls for responsibility on the part of the government to ensure that those external forces have withdrawn, and those forces which are not part of the NDF have withdrawn from Tigray. And in the first place, the reason why we have been fighting has everything to do with ensuring the security and safety of our people. As long as that safety and security could be ensured one way or another, we would not be insisting on carrying artillery pieces or tanks. That's where we are.
You're saying no disarmament as long as there are any Eritrean troops within Ethiopia?
Yeah, that's the agreement, yes.
Well, that was Getachew Reda from the TPLF speaking to me from Mekelle, and we will hear more from that interview later, but I'd like to get reaction from our panel. And Alex Rondos, there's going to be a danger, isn't there, that the Tigrayans are going to say we're not laying down arms until the Eritreans leave, and the Eritreans are going to say we're not leaving until they disarm?
Well, the Eritreans made a decision and an agreement with the government of Ethiopia, and they were invited in, or have invited themselves in, I suspect the former, and it's going to be up to the government of Ethiopia, according to this agreement, to get them to leave. The Tigrayans, I don't see them, when they made this agreement, they still have some 200,000 men and women under arms as we speak. That's a well-oiled, coiled spring, as it were. And I think that's one of the realities that Getachew Reda is mentioning. And it's not so much a threat, it is a reality. And that has to be taken into account. And it's interesting to me that the government of Ethiopia must have taken that into account and knowingly entered into this agreement. So what appears like possibly an agreement from a very weak point from the Tigrayan side, I see an area where the government of Ethiopia has to step up now and assume its responsibilities in this very, very public agreement. And perhaps they and the Tigrayans might find cause to cooperate in achieving that if they really do want to liberate the country from foreign forces.
That's interesting. I mean, Sadali, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed said he got 100% of what he wanted from the negotiations. Would you agree with him, or would you agree with Alex Rondos that it's rather more complicated than that?
The Prime Minister has a knack for oversimplifying things, and often he uses it to rile up his base. What I see this document, even though it's unfavorable for the security structure of Tigrayans, for their safety, what I see is a Tigray that fought back a siege, a Tigray that fought back armies of multiple countries. Although it's not a favorable deal for the Tigray's safety and security, look back, sit back and look deeply in it. You'll find a Tigray that humbled the rest of the world and Ethiopia.
Alex Deval, I don't think we can let Tigray off entirely here, or the TPL off entirely here, can we? I mean, they had a role in fighting a needless, unnecessary war. It wasn't all one-sided. Wars are never one-sided. They're always two sides to a conflict.
Certainly there were political blunders by the TPLF in the lead up to the war, and even during the war. I mean, the story during the last 2 years has been that the Tigrayan people and their defense forces have resisted in an extraordinarily heroic way, far beyond the expectations of anybody. But the Tigray leadership has not articulated a political agenda to resolve the war, neither an agenda with its own people, nor building alliances with other groups in Ethiopia, and therefore leaving the national political arena to be dominated by Abiy in particular. And I think that is one of the reasons why they were compelled to sign such a politically unfavourable agreement.
A reminder, you're listening to The Real Story from the BBC World Service with me, Chris Morris. This week we're trying to assess whether the war between the Ethiopian government and its regional adversary, the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, could really be coming to an end. And we're looking at the massive humanitarian crisis the conflict has produced. We're joined by Alex Rondos. He was EU Special Representative to the Horn of Africa from 2012 until 2021. He joins us from Nairobi. Alex Deval is the Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He joins us from Boston. Sadali Lema is an Ethiopian journalist and a leading advocate of media and press freedoms. She's the founder of Addis Standard Publications, and she joins us from Germany. So, following several days of peace talks in South Africa earlier this month, military leaders from the warring side, the government of Ethiopia and officials from the Tigray region signed an agreement to end fighting after almost 2 years of renewed civil war. Let's just remind ourselves how this happened. At a press briefing, the Nigerian mediator Olusegun Obasanjo said the two sides had also agreed to a disarmament plan.
The two parties in the Ethiopian conflict have formally agreed to the cessation of hostilities, as well as to systematic, orderly, smooth, and coordinated disarmament.
The Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has described the agreement as monumental and committed to implementing it. He said earlier this week that the people of Tigray must be able to resume their normal lives.
What we saw in Tigray is that the people want peace. They want water. They want electricity and food. We saw that they do not have any problem with their Amhara, Afar and Oromo brothers. If we can continue like this, I think it will be good. For my part, I want to see peace. I'm happy that peace is coming. I want to do all I can to make sure that this peace remains intact.
And the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken welcomed the agreement.
The cessation of hostilities signed earlier this week between the government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front shows what we can achieve when we support African-led solutions. We applaud the African Union, the governments of Kenya and South Africa for driving this process, and we appreciated the opportunity for the United States to offer support. The situation is fragile. There will be challenges ahead. But the United States is committed to working with our partners toward a durable peace.
Well, the deal commits the parties to facilitate unhindered humanitarian access to Tigray, home to more than 5 million people after more than 2 years of aid restrictions. The African Union has called the deal a new dawn, so warm words all round. And after such a brutal period, this has to be seen as a moment of some hope. But the words have to be followed up by actions. Alex Rondos, what are the most important parts of this peace deal? Obviously, a cessation of hostilities, the commencement, we hope, of the delivery of humanitarian aid. What else is sticking it together?
Well, what will stick it together is, first of all, if you get the sequencing in order, no peace deal is going to be achieved by a sudden rush of simultaneous moves. There's a lot of orchestration needed. So what's needed now? First, make sure that food starts going in and humanitarian supplies goes in to everyone, everywhere in Tigray. That's going to be the only thing that gives confidence to Tigrayan people. Secondly, it's going to need the containment of what I would call the spoilers. There are people who feel that they've lost out from this deal, and it's those who are against the notion of Tigray being reassociated with Ethiopia and the government of Ethiopia. The Eritreans, who are not named as such in the agreement, nevertheless are the foreign force present. There are Amhara and other non-Tigrayan forces in Tigray. How they begin to move out, and to the degree to which the Tigrayan forces and the Ethiopian National Army can coordinate in as they try to disarm, that is going to be the condition upon getting these other groups out. That's the second. Third, there's going to have to be a commitment of some kind of financial resources to begin to reconstruct where the damage has been caused. And it's got to begin in the places where there's been fighting, and then the rest of Ethiopia eventually, assuming all of this is implemented in a way that people will trust. I think these are the main points that have to be addressed now and will give some degree of momentum to the trust building.
And just a reminder for our audience, Amhara is a neighbouring region to Tigray within Ethiopia, whose forces have also got involved in this sort of complex overlapping fighting which has been going on for the last couple of years. Alex Duval, do you think the deal that's been put together is strong enough to survive?
I think there are two fundamental weaknesses that need to be overcome in this agreement, which was a very rushed agreement. It's a very technically substandard agreement. The first is that normally an agreement of this type would be the building built on a foundation, and that foundation would be a political pact between the two principal belligerents. That is, between the Tigray leadership and the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. There is no such political pact as of yet. What Abiy Ahmed is doing is like the former Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh. He's dancing on the heads of snakes. The other fundamental weakness is that normally African Union-led talks, which in the past have been extremely professionally run, they include the United Nations, they include the European Union, they include other partners such as the US that provide technical expertise and financial assistance and political cover. In this case, they were almost all excluded pretty much entirely. So we have a monitoring and verification mechanism that doesn't involve the UN, doesn't report publicly. And this deal can only work if those international partners give it full support, not least because the Ethiopian government is financially dependent upon them. And they are not going to be ready to support it fully unless they are more fully involved in the design and the implementation of the agreement.
Sadale, how's the agreement been received elsewhere in the country, in the rest of Ethiopia?
There's a mixed reaction to it. For one thing, the nature of the political alliance the prime minister built around himself in conducting this war is such that you cannot satisfy it with one-size-fits-all kind of agreement. So there is a dissatisfaction from his Amhara allies for not being included in that. Obviously, we don't know what the reaction from Eritrea is yet. It's very much a coded message that we're receiving. But others are receiving it with a sigh of relief. Just by the idea that this war will be over has brought a lot of optimism in many, many Ethiopians.
And of course, there are a lot of questions in all of this for the Ethiopian government itself. And as I said earlier in the programme, we asked them for an interview. They said yes, and then sadly they pulled out. But their representatives have been speaking publicly. The day the peace deal was signed in South Africa, Redwan Hussein, the government's national security advisor, called for outside support to help the agreement hold.
We are confident that friends of Ethiopian members of the diplomatic community will lend their support in rebuilding infrastructure in affected communities and the economic recovery of the country. We call on all types of media outlets to support peace, reconciliation, unity and prosperity in Ethiopia.
Zenebe Kebede Korcho is the permanent representative of Ethiopia to the United Nations office in Geneva. When the BBC asked him a few weeks ago if Eritrean troops had been told to leave Ethiopia, he gave this response.
This peace negotiation is between the TPLF and the government of Ethiopia. It is not a peace negotiation between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Therefore, it deals with how Ethiopia will maintain peace and order, constitutionality, protect and ensure the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ethiopia. The government of Ethiopia has never been, for the last 2 years, in control of the Ethiopian Northern Territory, which has been under the control of the TPLF, which has been provoking and threatening the government of Eritrea. And Eritrea might have acted within its own territory and with its own merit to protect its sovereignty and its security. Otherwise, I haven't been aware of Eritrea's involvement and Eritrea's fighting along with Ethiopian force.
Zenebe Kebede Korcho speaking for the Ethiopian government. Back to our panel. Alex Duval, what incentive does the government have to make peace? I mean, elsewhere in the country, the economy has tanked as a result of the war, hasn't it? Inflation soaring, some international donors more reluctant to help. It's clearly nothing like the humanitarian crisis in Tigray. But has that put pressure on the government to do a deal?
I think it has. I would say in passing that the Ethiopian ambassador to Geneva was simply not telling the truth. The substantial portions of the Ethiopian army were actually placed under the command of Eritrea for the operations over the last few months. And everybody knows that the Eritrean army had most of its forces inside Tigray. But Ethiopia has come to the point of financial collapse. It's not getting the funds that it needs from its institutions, especially the IMF. Its national institutions have crumbled. It's lost literally hundreds of thousands of casualties during this war. And it's really a rabble in uniform with drones. And there is a major insurgency in the Oromo region to the west, south and east of Addis Ababa, which is escalating by the day. The Ethiopian government needs peace in Tigray to fight a war in Oromia. And if that were to be what transpires, it would be a complete tragedy. I think the next attention has to be on resolving that conflict.
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of things, aren't there, which could make implementing this deal difficult. But there's one overwhelming reason why it really needs to be done, and that's the humanitarian crisis, staggering in scale. Now, reliable estimates are that hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in the last 2 years, either in the fighting or as a result of it, and millions of civilians are in urgent need of assistance. The first trucks of medical supplies and trucks from the World Food Programme have come in the last few days. Before we talk more with our panel, let's hear again from Getachew Reda, the representative of the TPLF in Mekelle. I asked him how desperate the need for humanitarian aid is in Tigray.
3 months before there was a need for 6 million people. The fact that there are more IDPs simply has complicated matters even more.
Just to explain to our audience, when you say IDPs, you mean internally displaced people, the millions of people who've had to flee from the fighting. Is it possible to give us a realistic assessment of how many people at the moment are in desperate need of food and at risk of famine?
The number of needy in Tigray, about 6 million plus. Now with an additional 1.5 million people displaced from different areas as a result of the war, the number of the needy is not only the number that's rising, but the severity of the crisis they are facing is becoming unbearable. Whatever commitments the U.S. government or international aid agencies might have made, it still remains to be seen if that commitment is going to be implemented, because it requires that the peace agreement between our two sides holds. That's where we are now.
And you've said that everything you do is driven by the needs of the people of Tigray, but doesn't your movement have to take some responsibility for the terrible plight so many of them are in? You've been fighting a needless, unnecessary war.
We were fighting because war was imposed on us. To the extent that we'll have to account for it. Let's wait until the dust settles, and whatever political dialogue will bring about by way of judgment, we'll see who is going to be responsible. At this point in time, I don't think it's time for recriminations. The war was imposed on the people of Tigray, and we've been defending our interests, but we have reached a point where the number of civilian casualties and humanitarian catastrophe has reached a level where sustaining yet another round of conflict can only be exceptionally disastrous. As far as responsibility goes, we'll see whatever happens. At this point in time, I don't consider myself or my movement to be responsible for anything.
You say it's not a time for recrimination, but at some stage it has to be a time for accountability. But you mention atrocities by your opponents. International human rights groups are very clear that atrocities committed by Tigrayan forces as well. You have no defence against that.
Yes, there have been allegations of atrocities even allegedly perpetrated by our forces. We have always been consistent in expressing our openness for an independent investigation. What we are saying is, as long as there is credible information that our forces have also committed those crimes, we cannot vouch for every individual fighter. But one thing we can assure you is that there was no systematic war crime that was committed by our forces. There could be individual cases here and there, and we are more than willing to even subject ourselves for investigation, like I said.
You're saying that in time you would be willing to bring people on your own side to justice if it is proven that they have committed crimes?
That's for sure. That's for sure.
Getachew Reda from the TPLF. We'll come back to the question of war crimes in a moment, but I just wanted to start with where that interview started, with the humanitarian crisis. And Alex Duval, we know now the World Food Programme and the ICRC are starting to get aid convoys in, but above all, I guess, they need guarantees that they can do that safely. In your analysis, how likely is that to happen?
I think the guarantees of safety are, frankly, a bit of a red herring. It was perfectly possible before the breakdown in the humanitarian truce in August. It was perfectly possible for convoys to go in, for flights to go in, for all sorts of humanitarian supplies to be distributed in complete safety throughout Tigray.
Are you saying they didn't push hard enough?
Absolutely. The internationals succumbed to the pressure, sort of bureaucratic war of attrition imposed upon them by the federal government. And they went along with the overall strategy of the siege, it has to be said. A war crime of mass starvation. It was allowed to proceed to its inexorable end, which is utter humanitarian calamity that we face today.
Alex Rondos, you've been part of that international bureaucracy. I know you're not now in quite the same way, but would you agree with that assessment?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I confess to, when I was still officially in an official position, to have been quite embarrassed to be associated with an international effort that fell far below the standards of anything that one considered to be just humane.
Why did that happen?
One was, I think, the degree to which the whole issue was so far away from general international attention, and very quickly the way in which Tigray was isolated meant that there were very few eyes on what and in as to what was happening. I think that's one. Two, I think the Ethiopian government was very, very successful in portraying itself as a government which needed to be supported to maintain unity and defeat a rebellion. And I think many people in the international community were ready to submit to that argument rather than be a little more sharper in their questioning. And some were just downright morally lazy. I had to listen to people, diplomats from countries who should have known better, making distinctions between deportations and ethnic cleansing, and others who said we need to have more evidence and affirmation that there's been rape. Well, I'm not quite sure what you need for that.
OK, well, the international aid agencies obviously aren't here to defend themselves. They may have a different view, and that is going to have to be a debate for another day. But what we shouldn't forget in all of this is when we talk about these big numbers, millions of people, these are all individuals, aren't they, Sadale? And I wonder, when the TPLF says 7.5 million people need assistance, is it possible to say with any degree of accuracy how many of that vast number of people really are dangerously close to starvation?
At least officially, the USAID was saying a year and a half ago that around 900,000 people are in the famine zone. This is a euphemism to say they are facing famine. But let's not forget that the access to humanitarian supply was restricted the moment the war broke out. So when you calculate that kind of blockade, systematic blockade from the very beginning of the war, and you add numbers that were food insecure already before the war, I don't think it's really that difficult to calculate the staggering amount of people in need of food aid. I think famine has already set in. A lot of people have died already. I don't think we need that kind of calculation to guess what has happened.
Well, it's a sobering assessment. And before we move on, I do just want to go back to the issue of war crimes, which we discussed with the TPLF a few moments ago. Alex Deval, the TPLF representative, said they would bring their own people to justice if there is clear evidence against them. Now, we've thrown a lot of accusations and heard a lot of accusations thrown at the Ethiopian government. Do you believe the Tigrayan forces are sufficiently aware of their responsibilities to actually bring people to justice as they've been proven to have committed crimes?
I do think so. The agreement does make provision for accountability, but only within the Ethiopian government's own mechanisms. And I fear that means it will be seriously diluted. Yes, both sides are clearly responsible for abuses, but if you read carefully the most recent report of the UN Human Rights Committee of Experts, they clearly say that only one side, and that is the federal government side, was responsible for crimes against humanity and the crime of starvation. So we need to hold both sides to the same standards, but it doesn't mean that they are all equally responsible for the same abuses.
OK, we were talking about the prospect of American sanctions a few minutes ago, and I just wanted to pull back a bit and look at some of the wider international context. The African Union, as we've said, has led the mediation process which produced the peace agreement. During the war, the Tigrayans have criticised the role which the African Union played. Do you think that is justified, Alex Deval, the fact that the AU headquarters are in Addis Ababa? Are they genuinely a neutral arbiter in this?
This type of deal, the agreement that was made this month, could have been made 2 years ago if the African Union had actually upheld its basic norms and principles of expeditious peacemaking whenever a conflict breaks out. I think it's a sad failing of the African Union.
Sadale Lema, is there another side to that argument? The African solution to an African war? Why should it be outsiders who come in and try and sort it out?
I broadly agree with what Alex said. It was a spectacular failure. Not only that, in the initial period of the war, Cyril Ramaphosa sent 3 African-wise men and women to Ethiopia. And when Abiy Ahmed turned them down and they returned back empty-handed, the AU failed to step up. At that time, Ramaphosa was the chairman of the AU. So the commission failed to defend him, to say that this is wrong, to turn them down, because this could be our opportunity of, implementing African solution for African problems.
Alex Rondos, at least they appear to have brought the fighting to end, at least for now. That surely should be welcomed.
What I welcome is that 3 prominent African individuals who constituted the panel which conducted the negotiations retrieved some honor. for Africa. That is former President Obasanjo. I think really finally came to the party in a way that proved to be helpful on certain issues. Former President Kenyatta of Kenya and the former Deputy President of South Africa, they're the ones who did the heavy lifting in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And I think that points forward to ask ourselves, for Africa, who are the people of this new generation who can bring wisdom to bear when there are these terrible conflicts, and so as not to allow, the people's lives in Africa to be hostages to, what is sort of bureaucratic caprice, I suppose. And this is not just true of Africa, it's true of anywhere else.
And a lot of what we've discussed begs the question of what influence the wider world can have on this very, very complex conflict. Presumably, the aid effort is one part of that. The aid effort has to be international, involving the UN and other agencies. Is that what will internationalise the implementation of the ceasefire and other provisions of the deal? Alex de Waal.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the aid effort has to come first. And then it's desperately important that insofar as the international community's strategy has been founded on the presupposition that Ethiopia must be stable and that having Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed at its helm is the route to that stability. They also need to get engaged in addressing all the other problems of Ethiopia too, because it is a state, let's put it generously, that is accelerating towards state collapse, and it needs to be diverted from that path as quickly as possible.
A final thought from all three of you. It's obviously fragile. How optimistic are you that this process can last? Let's go to Alex Rondos first.
Yes, I think it can, provided the parties who want to support this, as well as the two parties themselves, are willing to be confident, trust enough each other, but also synchronize their actions. There's a lot of technicality, but this is where the international community has to step in at the right time and in the right way. You can't ask people to seek a dividend for peace on an empty stomach. Someone's got to provide some money, and it's got to be smart money, not just money thrown at this. And it's about a country of 110 million people, which, as Alex de Waal just said, is on the brink of financial collapse. And that needs some serious thinking about the debt and everything. But it can't be a free lunch. This is the deal has to be peace, real peace, if the international community is going to provide. And the international community cannot be held hostage and told there won't be peace until you put up money. You don't do business with those type of people.
And Sadale Lema, can you find some cause for optimism in the events of the last few weeks?
I'm afraid I can't, but it depends on two major things to happen internationally and domestically. Internationally, I think the international community must stop measuring its success, its diplomatic success, by counting trucks, how many trucks are entering Tigray, and really look into a comprehensive peace process in Ethiopia, not just between Tigray and Addis, Mekelle and Addis, but also paying attention to what exactly is happening in the rest of the country. They might just be lucky enough to pinpoint why is Ethiopia being in turmoil like that, end-to-end turmoil today. So looking into a comprehensive solution to the crisis in Ethiopia is a must for the international community if they want to save the Ethiopian state in one form or another. Domestically, I think the Ethiopian government need to step up and show its fidelity to the Ethiopian constitution, territorial integrity and sovereignty of the Ethiopian state. Unless and otherwise they do that, we will not be seeing an end to this conflict.
And finally, Alex de Waal, there have to be some things to build on from here, don't there?
I think what we have to build on is that the leadership of Tigray and of Ethiopia looked into the abyss. And it was the Tigrayans who flinched first. And facing utter calamity and the complete exhaustion of their people, but also of war-making efforts on both sides, they said enough is enough. And I think if that is the fundamental recognition that comes out of the negotiations, the agreements of this month, then Ethiopia can find a way back.
Well, it's a sobering story, but that's it for this week on The Real Story. Thanks to our guests, the two Alexes, Alex de Waal and Alex Rondos, and to Ethiopian journalist Sadale Lema. You can listen back to this and previous editions of the programme on our podcast feed or on the BBC Sounds app. But for this week, from me, Chris Morris, and the team, that's The Real Story. Thanks for your company, and do join us again next time.